Hi everyone, so today we're going to discuss about AWS Cloud Attack Vectors and the security controls that can be applied. So before we get started, there's a little bit about me. I'm a security analyst at Appsecco. I just love to break web application, API and cloud security. I'm a member of different communities such as null, InfoSecGirls, Breaking Barriers, Leading Circle. I'm an active speaker who loves to share her knowledge with the community or in any conference. Agenda of the today talk is what are the possible attack vectors for the AWS cloud, mechanisms that help to identify those attack vectors, some of misconfiguration like IAM misconfiguration, S3 misconfiguration, EC2 misconfiguration we're going to discuss today. Then detection that can help to identify those misconfiguration and the security controls. So what are the possible attack vectors, right? First is leaked credentials. Second, instance misconfiguration, like you found the EBC snapshot is publicly accessible, AMI is publicly accessible of the instance, right? Then EC2 instance having the CV against it, or the particular EC2 instance is publicly available, right? Those are the instance misconfiguration. In using default settings, for example, you didn't enable that for the S3 bucket, right? That you having the sensitive information and you haven't enabled S3 with KMS encryption. Then it's again issue, because what if someone get your S3 bucket data and that is even in the plain text, right? Like for example, not encrypted. For example, it's having the credit card details or the credentials, right? So you like you should use, but one of the reason it's default setting, and another is like you haven't used the IMDA VS2 version, and that leads to the SSRF vulnerability, right? S3 misconfiguration, like allowing public access or the allowing any user of the AWS to perform any action on S3, right? So S3 misconfiguration. Then access control mix configuration, like you didn't mention, hey, this particular user should has only this much access, and you are ending up giving more privilege that that particular user is supposed to do, and that can leads to the external attack vector and as well as internal threat, right? Exposure of the resources via firewall, right? So if you didn't configure the firewall properly, you ending up giving your resource access to any user over the internet. That's most dangerous. Then network security misconfiguration, if the RVPC is not properly configured, or your inbound outbound rules is not properly configured, right? Then it's again issue, anyone on the internet can access, right? Insecure custom application. So if the web application hosted on EC2 is not properly configured, or it's vulnerable to like SSRF or LFI, then it's again issue, because attacker can get access to your AWS credentials. So you know that, hey, these are the possible attack vectors. Now, how can I find those? For that, you have to perform reconnaissance. And I have covered different ways to perform reconnaissance, for finding credentials, for finding a EC2 instance, or to finding S3 bucket. Finding credentials. Look for the hard-coded credentials stored in JavaScript. Then AWS Cognito credentials in the response. You can find it. If like, how do you find it? I have attached a screenshot. I'm going to discuss how can you find it, right? Then if the web application hosted a EC2 instance is vulnerable to SSRF or LFI, then also attacker can find those credentials. Code repositories such as Bitbucket and GitHub, web on that also you can find that if public, for example, nowadays many companies publicly expose their code on GitHub. That's all right, but if you are storing the credential on the repository, then it's an issue. You can just or the any attacker can find the credential on GitHub, and you are ending up like getting exposed your credential on the publicly repositories such as GitHub and Bitbucket. And AWS error message such as access denied, and in the sometimes if the properly not configured, right, it just disclosing that hey, this is access denied, but your credential are this, right? So that's issue. Publicly BS snapshot, then EMI related credential being leaked in the public images. Then S3 bucket is also sometimes organizations store their employee credentials or the admin credential being stored in the S3 bucket, right? Then it's again issue. We're gonna discuss in upcoming slide that how can you find those. Then RDS public snapshot. In those you can find the RDS related credential, database credential information. Then people looking for help online ending up copy pasting that complete information. Like they say, hey, I want, like I'm facing this issue. This is some my credential or user ID. Can you please help me out? And that ending up getting article that hey, this what credential belongs to this particular user. So these are the standard recon techniques that can help you to get started with the finding credentials, right? So one of the I have mentioned, right, that in the response, the cognitive credential being linked. So this is how it looked like. Now for the EC2 misconfiguration, right? So how can you find the public EC2 instance, right? For that you need to have the access, right? So compute one Amazon AWS.com you mentioned in the census, and you will have the list of EC2 instance and see if those are the EC2 instances publicly accessible, right? Then you can use Google Doc, you can use Showdown as well, CM search you can apply, and you can customize the result based on the what you want, right? So query based on that. Then another way is to instance only accessible to this IP address, right? Then and there is no prevention against it for the SSH, right? Then you can just do SSH on that particular instance. Same way you can access the MySQL database as well. Now you must be thinking, hey, how can I found the RDS endpoint? Basically, you can mention site is this and RDS, Amazon AWS.com. So use the Google Doc. For finding S3 bucket, you can use Google Search, Google Doc, Showdown, Census, use OSN tools such as Sublister and AMAS, brute force of naming, like there is standard ways of for the S3 bucket, right? Naming convention is the S3 like site S3 Amazon.com, right? Or S3 Amazon S3 site Amazon AWS, right? So these are the standards. So you can just brute force it, or in the DNS record, right? You can also find the S3 bucket related information. Then certification transparency log. Then you can use numerous bucket finder scripts, such as there are so many scripts available on the internet, such as lazy S3 bucket finder, right? So you can use those as well. And gray hat Watford bucket search you can use to finding the S3 bucket. I have mentioned that how can you find the S3 bucket using Google Docs. So this is the way you can find it. After knowing that what are the attack vectors and how can you perform the reconnaissance, you should look for the misconfiguration related issue, right? So one of the I have covered is misconfigured S3 bucket. Now, why it's a misconfigured? Because of the policy. Okay, so one is this: you are allowing public access to any. So for explicitly you saying that object can be public, so anyone on internet can access this bucket. Most strangest one is defining full access to authenticate AWS users group. So they're saying anyone with having the valid AWS credential or the authenticated user can access my bucket and even perform copy, read, and the delete operation. So you are basically affecting whole CIA triangle, right? So it's most stranger one policy to be in. Then bucket policy with the read access policy. So some organizations say, hey, we have allow only read access policy, but you are having in the bucket the sensitive information such as PIA or the purchase history information or credential itself, right? So you should avoid bucket with the read access policy. Then you almost forget about encrypting your AWS S3 bucket. So for example, the bucket having the sensitive information and someone got access, right, and download the data like purchase history or the credential, and your bucket is not encrypted, then they can have the whole bunch of the credential that has been stored or PI information or credit card details which is stored in the bucket. But what if you have applied the encryption technique? Then even though they got the bucket, but they are not able to get the data that hey, what are the data available, because the attacker is not having the master key. So you should use the encryption. So what attack vectors we have covered for the like why S3 misconfiguration happened right so far. So allowing public access to bucket, defining full access control to authenticated AWS user groups, defining bucket with the read access policy, enabling write access to everyone group, forgetting to encrypt your AWS resources. Now you've got to know, hey, this happened. Now how you do investigate, or what can be done to investigate, or what configuration or what services can be used, right? So guard duty help to finding S3 will list and S3 bucket and bucket ARN and even the bucket owner in the finding details. So you might have the fair understanding, okay, what's the ARN of that particular bucket and who is the owner of this bucket, right? Then you can use AWS Cloud Trail log, like at what time the request being made, from which IP the request being made, right? You can use Trusted Advisor if you configure your S3 bucket, right? And you have allowed the public access. That if the Trusted Advisor is enabled, then it will give you alert, hey, this is not how you configure, right? Then CloudWatch metric is again the best you can use to get the alert, right? For example, there is get request happen, put request happen, or the delete request happen for your S3 bucket. Cloud, if you configure the CloudWatch metric, then you will get the alert that hey, this is a request being made from this particular resources, right? So it's good to have enable config the AWS manage rule. There are two rules you can choose: S3 bucket read prohibited and S3 bucket public write prohibited, based on what applicable to your organization, right? So based on that, you should configure all this. Now you configure all this, but how do you investigate that, hey, this S3 misconfiguration happened, how can I investigate? So you should have proper logging mechanism in the place. Now, after investigate or all the alerting in the place, what security controls can help to prevent from the S3 misconfiguration? Implement least privilege access, right? Don't allow any authenticated user or any public user to have access to your S3 bucket. Use IAM roles for application and the AWS service that require Amazon S3 access. Then enable multi-factor authentication, at least for the delete operation. So even the attacker got the credential and able to delete your bucket, but he might not able to delete your bucket, right? He can just only get the data. So availability part will be not being compromised. Consider encryption at data rest, because even the attacker will get the bucket, right? But the data itself, it's encrypted, right? So, and the attacker is not having the master key. So this is how you can prevent your confidentiality as well. Enforcing SSL, no standard practice. Consider VPC endpoint for Amazon S3 access. For if you are having large organization or any organization and you are saying that, hey, this S3 bucket only accessible this organization employee, so you should consider mentioning VPC endpoint, right? So as I mentioned, the S3 bucket having sensitive information, it can be having cloud log as well, right? So yeah, one of the things. Consider S3 object log. So it prevent being like object data being deleted, which is present in S3, right? So S3 object log. Pre-signed URL you can assign to the authenticated user. So only the user having pre-signed URL can only access this S3 bucket. Most preferable. Then enable versioning. If any change happen, that new version will create. So this is how can you track the S3 related operation. Second is you found the credential. Okay, you might be thinking, hey, I found the credentials. Am I just supposed to file it or say, hey, I found the credential? That's it. No, you should enumerate the permission. So this is the standard flow I follow. Got the credential, I try to enumerate the permission and see what kind of access I'm having, right? Although what kind of access I'm having using victim credentials. If I'm having any S3 bucket related or the C2 instance and try to get sensitive information. After that, is there having anything that I can perform the privilege escalation? Yes, so this is you should also taking care of it. If not sensitive information, is that policy is not assigned properly to that particular user, and if I can perform the privilege escalation and get the sensitive information. So this is what your attack flow look like when you got the credential. So yeah, as an attacker, I got the victim credential. Now try to enumerate the permission and found that the user having the IAM related and the or user can list anything. But what interesting to me that is having STS permission, okay. But still, it's not having like I can have the access to S3 or just download the data or do what I want to do. So what can be done? So we are aware that we can use the STS. So try to get who is the user and is there any policy attached to that user, right? So yeah, this is the way I found the user and the policy being attached to that particular user. Then try to get the policy and see what kind of policy it has and what is the default policy. So default policy is version 1. Then list out the all the policy available for that particular user. So that might having older or the misconfigured policy or the overly permissive policy that might help us. So you should look for all the possible policy. So we found that, hey, there are 5 policy available. Then enumerate different policies so that you can have the idea of what kind of access you have. So previously we had the get and list permission, but we found that, hey, if I having the admin level access, why admin level? Because action star, resource star, that explicitly saying that you can perform anything on any resources. So admin level access. Now attacker inside made, hey, what can be done? Make this policy as a default policy, right? So I just made this policy as a default policy, and no error message came. So we sure that, yeah, we are able to make this policy as a default policy, and the privilege escalation happened. How? From get to the whole read, write, and update operation we have, right? Like you can do anything on any resources. This is the POC for that, like how, what kind of privilege I got after making that policy as a default policy. So yeah. So what was the approach so far? You found a hard-coded credential, like one of the attack vector was you found a hard-coded credential, you try to enumerate the permission, then you got the IAM related access, you try to enumerate the policy, and one of the policy was having overly permissive permission, like admin level access, and we try to make it as a default policy, and it was success. So when you find the credential and that was not having too much access, don't give up, see what else you can do. So this is how we can go beyond one of the tasks. So after yeah, so I have included the POC that how can you do the same actions from the management console. Basically, I'm doing the same thing from the management console. See, this is the V4 here, having the admin level access, and I'll try to make it as a default policy. And see the permission now I'm having is a admin level, right? So now all things you found that, hey, my credential been compromised. This policy was overly permissive, right? So to avoid this, right? So what can be investigation or the detection services? For the investigation or detection purpose, you can use the services or the tools to identify or to get alert, right? So for that, you can use trusted advisor or the check IAM credential report to check like when the last credential being used, at what date, at what time, who used, right? Then use IAM tools such as IAM policy simulator so that you can just see, like you can simulate the policy and see what kind of access this user having, right? Use config rule to see what are the policy in the use, that so you can use this rule IAM policy in use, that config rule that checks whether IAM policy ARN is attached to IAM user, right? I basically specific this rule because this is related to our attack scenario, right? You can apply many rules, I just mentioned one of that. Then you can use access advisor to get the information about last access information, right? And what kind of access happens. Use CrowdTrail for the logging, like API request obviously being made, right? Then at what time, from which IP it has been requested, right? So you will have the logging information for investigate and analysis and to take step further. You can use monitor CloudWatch alarms to prevent or to get alerted in the future, right? So for example, you can enable for root logins if any IAM policy changes happen. That is also you can record right? So you get alarm that, hey, this policy changed. So you can directly perform action. In this case, policy change, and I made it admin. So you should just had the CloudWatch alarm active that you've been notified for same. Then same unauthorized API calls happen. Then again you can being alerted. Cloud Trail configuration changes happen. Authentication failure. All these you should be taking care of it. Now you are being alerted and detected, hey, my credential being leaked or compromised. You will be like, what should be done, right? So for that, you can just basically create the new credentials and disable the previous compromised credential and remove it. But making sure that you are first creating the new credential and then make deactive the older credential, so that if you directly remove, right, the credential, then your might be your website may be bricked down or not like web application will not work properly, right? So making sure that you follow this standard approach. So far what we have done that we create the new credential, disable the older credential so that no longer used to your access account, apply list privilege to that particular user, and avoid creating user with excessive permission. Now, security controls that can be applied to prevent from this kind of issue. Use secret manager to store your credentials securely. Grant list privilege access. Use access levels to review IAM permission, right? Configure a multi-factor authentication for your most sensitive information like delete or removing the cloud trail or cloud trail configuration changes, right? Enable multi-factor authentication. Rotate your credential regularly and ensure log metric filter and alarm exists for IAM policy. So you just get alert and you take the action, right? So these are the controls you can apply. Now another scenario I have covered, that what if you found the public IP of the EC2 instance? Now why I'm finding this, right? So possible is misconfigured firewall happen, right? No properly inbound outbound rule has been mentioned. So that's why EC2 instance publicly accessible to you. Now you got the public IP of the EC2 instance. What should be your next step look like, right? Is there any default configuration being used? Is there any ports are open? Is web application running on this particular IP? This is you should must look for, right? I will give you overview why, because I have covered the one of the scenario. So okay, so I found that I got the IP and this particular IP having the web application running on port number 80, but it's saying that URL must be string not defined. Okay, so I got that, hey, something URL parameter being used. So here I say URL ifconfig.com and I got the IP address of the server, right? So I said, okay, this is vulnerable to SSRI. Okay, so but you should not limit yourself. Hey, I found the SSRI. If your application is vulnerable to SSRI, you should start digging into it, this particular vulnerability. That hey, web application vulnerable to SSRI it's hosted on EC2 instance. Okay, role is attached to it, and try to get the IAM role credential and see what kind of level access you might ending up finding, admin level or S3 bucket data. So this is how you escalate security severity, right? So here we did same and we found that hey, this is what the role attached to it and these are the security credential. After getting credential, enumerate permission, and we found that hey, S3 related permission and that also having the credit card details and the admin a credential in it, right? So you just using command to copy or the get data in your system, and I was able to get the admin data, right? So now you can think of like what kind of access I am having as admin. So just moving to IP to the admin level access, right? So just let's do attack surface analysis why this happened. One of the factor default configuration setting usage, right? You are just allowing to EC2 instance publicly available, misconfigure firewall. Web application hosted on EC2 was vulnerable to SSRF, right? Like no input validation was there on the web application. Role was having to access to work with the S3 bucket, and the data storage in AWS S3 was not encrypted. So, for example, even though attacker able to get the S3 bucket, but if it's encrypted, how do he get the like credit card details or admin credential, right? So that you could have prevented sensitive information being stored on S3 bucket. You should not exactly store the admin credential or any user's credential in S3 bucket. So you may feel like, hey, this is most similar sound to like Capital One Bridge. Yes. So in the Capital One Bridge, the similar scenario was that misconfigured firewall attacker was able to gaining access to an EC2 instance, and that is vulnerable to the SSRF, and gaining the IAM role that is allowed to access S3 bucket, and in the S3 bucket he found the credit card details of the users, like millions of users. So for this particular scenario, what were the attack vectors? Web application hosted on EC2 instance is vulnerable to SSRF, IMDVS version 1 being used, improper bucket policy, storing sensitive information in the bucket, forgetting to encrypt S3 bucket data, right? So I can summarize that misconfigured firewall, right? One of the attack vector, S3 misconfiguration, right? Why S3 misconfiguration? Those are the explanation for that. Default setting usage, C, and the vulnerable web application. This is vulnerable to us. So this is how you can correlate the attack vectors. Now you get to know why this happened. Like in future, how can you detect, right? So you can use guard duty. If there is any C2 misconfiguration or compromise happen, guard duty will alert, help you to identify conflict rules that specific for EC2 IMDbase version 2 check. It basically check that if EC2 instance metadata version is configured with the instance metadata service version 2, right? So that is most important thing to prevent from the getting IAM role credential. Then Security Hub, it will just give you whole analysis, help you to identify that related to config rule, IAM access analyzer, then guard duty, all the findings you can get in the Security Hub. So you should use Security Hub flow logs, like to see like VPC flow logs from where the traffic is coming from, right? System manager to for the properly configure EC2 instance, right? Now you are aware that your EC2 instance is compromised, but what step you should take, right? For that, invalidate your temporary security credential immediately, stop compromising EC2 instance, take a snapshot of the EBS volume so that and deploy that particular instance in isolated environment that is being compromised. Isolated basically no internet access and ideally private subnet, and then read through the logs to figure out why, right? To prevent this kind of attacks, in future or misconfiguration in future, you can use the input validation to prevent from SSRF. Update your AWS EC2 instance metadata services. So even though it's vulnerable to SSRF, you are still the user will not get the IAM role credential, right? Then implement list privilege permission so that the attacker will have the list privilege access. Consider encryption of data at rest. I'll mention that why I mentioned. Then constantly monitor only permissive security use groups. Use your control tower for the separate logging activity and normal account activity. Security groups, why it's matter, because you can just mention that only the user which are present in the security groups that only allowed to access this EC2 instance. So you can avoid the publicly available EC2 instance. And why do you separate logging? So even the attacker got access to your credential, but he or she cannot remove the your cloud trail or any logging mechanism. And then use security hub, right? Like to have the whole analysis on plate. So things to note that to get to know about the attack vectors, right? You Reconnaissance and the OSN are the key to finding those attack vectors. Post exploitation has no limit with the cloud, so you should keep looking for the attack additional services like disturb logging and make code changes to attack users, right? Like internet security teams can check what can be done, so that in future, what if we are credential being compromised and another outsider attacker do anything with your services, right? So yeah, making sure that you always apply that least privilege access to any user role group, so that you at least avoid the attack surface area. And the most common things we have found: the misconfiguration of services, insecure programming practice, and insecure permission, like over permissive policy has been there, and that leads to the whole account takeover. Fall and the follow AWS security best practices to avoid or to being prevent from being compromised, or any prevent from being getting breached in future, right? I just mentioned some guidelines and tools that can help. So these are the guidelines. AWS white papers having the good documentation around it. AWS security audit guidelines. Then Scout suite for the automated CIS auditing, right? Benchmark auditing for the multi-cloud. Roller is basically automated auditing specific for AWS. S3 inspector to analysis what kind of permission having, right? Like you got the credential and you want to see, okay, what kind of, you don't want to go manually, you can just use this tool and see what kind of permission you have, like it's publicly accessible or it's having the authenticated, any authenticated user can perform any action, right? So it will give you information around it. Enumerate IAM, you can just enumerate the what kind of user, like what kind of access the particular user having. And Paco for the penetration testing purpose. It's a penetration testing. If any question I ask, question and answer, I'm open for the question and answer, and you can connect me on LinkedIn and the